The carriage wheels snapped on the north road, and Nora Fenwick was thrown against the door with her heart slamming before she even understood why. Mud sprayed the window. The horses screamed. For 3 long seconds the whole carriage tilted, and she grabbed the seat strap with both hands, certain the entire thing was about to roll into the ditch below. Then it stopped moving. It simply stopped, tilted at an angle, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. She sat there breathing hard, her bonnet knocked sideways, her gloves torn at the seam, and thought of all things about her mended dress. The one dress she owned that was fit for a duke's house. It was folded in the trunk behind her, and if that trunk had gone into the ditch with the wheel, she would arrive at Ravenswick Hall wearing whatever the driver had spare, which was nothing. The driver's face appeared at the window, pale and apologetic. He said the axle was cracked and they were still 4 miles from the gate. Nora looked past him at the gray afternoon light and the wet fields and did the arithmetic of a woman who had done arithmetic her whole life. 4 miles. No other carriage on this road until dusk. And the invitation which her family could not afford to waste, waiting at the end of it. She climbed down into the mud without complaint, hitched her skirt in one fist, and started walking. Ravenswick Hall stood on a rise above the river, and the closer Nora got, the more absurd she felt, walking toward a duke's front door with drying mud to her knees. She had heard about this house her whole life the way people hear about weather in another country, something that happens elsewhere. Now the gates were in front of her, iron and enormous, and a footman was staring at her as though she had crawled out of the ground itself. She gave her name. He did not believe her. She gave it again, more sharply, and something in her tone must have convinced him, because he opened the gate and told her to wait in the receiving hall while someone found out what was to be done with her trunk, if it was even recoverable. Inside, the receiving hall was already full. Nora had known, distantly, that she was not the only guest invited for the season. She had not understood the scale of it until she stood in that hall and counted heads. Women in silk the color of ripe plums and morning frost, women with maids fussing over the exact fall of a curl, women speaking to each other in the particular bright voices people use when they are pretending not to compete. She counted past 20 and stopped counting, because it did not matter exactly how many there were. It mattered that she was standing among them with mud on her hem, and no maid at all. A woman nearby, dressed in blue so pale it looked like it had been poured rather than sewn, glanced at Nora once and then did not look again. That single glance told Nora everything about how this week was going to go. She was shown to a small room at the end of a long corridor, far from the grander chambers where the other guests were housed. The lady of the house, a sharp-eyed woman called Beatrice who ran the estate with the discipline of a general, informed her without much warmth that dinner was at 8, that the Duke would not be joining tonight due to estate business, and that Nora's trunk had in fact been recovered from the ditch, slightly damp, and would be brought up shortly. Nora thanked her. Beatrice studied her for a moment too long, the way a woman studies an unexpected guest she has not yet decided how to categorize, and then left without another word. That night at dinner, Nora learned the shape of the competition she had wandered into. There were, she counted properly this time, 30 women seated at that long table, each one placed with obvious care, each one dressed as though for a portrait. The talk moved around her in currents she did not belong to. A woman 2 seats down described at length and with practiced modesty how she had once translated a page of Latin poetry for her own amusement. Another mentioned, as though it had simply occurred to her, that she rode astride and had once outpaced her brother's hunting party. A third laughed a laugh so carefully arranged that Nora nearly admired the craft of it. She realized, somewhere between the soup and the fish course, that every one of these women was performing for an audience of one man who was not even in the room. The Duke of Ashworth did not appear that night, nor the next morning. Nora heard him discussed constantly and saw him nowhere, which gave him the strange quality of a rumor rather than a person. She heard that his father was gravely ill upstairs, confined to a chamber at the end of the west wing, and that the old man's failing health was the true reason the house had filled with unmarried women this season. A title needed securing. An heir needed a mother arranged for him, before it was too late to arrange anything at all. She heard, too, that the Duke himself found the whole business tiresome, that he had grown sharp and short with his aunt over the guest list, that he had already turned away 2 women in the first week for reasons nobody could quite explain. This last detail interested Nora more than she expected it to. A man who turned people away without explanation was either cruel or very tired of being lied to, and she suspected, without knowing him at all, that it was the second thing. On the 3rd day she finally saw him. He came down into the garden where several of the women had gathered under the pretext of admiring the roses, though everyone understood the roses were incidental. Nora was there only because Beatrice had ordered every guest outside for air, and she stood at the edge of the group with her arms folded, watching the performance begin the moment he appeared. He was younger than she had pictured, and more tired-looking, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been smiled at too many times in 1 week. 2 women converged on him immediately, one asking his opinion on a poet Nora had never heard of, the other laughing before he had said anything remotely funny. He answered them both with the flat courtesy of someone reciting lines he had already recited many times that morning. His eyes moved over the group once, briefly, the way a man checks a room for the exit. They landed on Nora for less than a second. She had mud still faintly staining the toe of one boot, she was quite sure, and she had not curled her hair, and she was standing slightly apart from everyone else with an expression she suspected was not flattering. He looked away again just as quickly. She told herself she did not care, and was almost right. That evening, one of the older guests, a woman named Charlotte who seemed to have appointed herself an authority on the whole affair, explained the situation to Nora over tea as though doing her a great favor. 30 women had been invited, Charlotte said, because the Duke's aunt believed that variety would eventually produce a match, the way throwing enough seed at a field would eventually produce a crop. Some of the women were daughters of old friends. Some were the daughters of men who owed the estate money and had been informed, not quite in these words, that a good marriage would settle the debt rather nicely. A few, Charlotte admitted with a small, satisfied smile, were simply the most beautiful women available in 3 counties, invited because beauty alone occasionally worked where cleverness failed. Nora asked carefully which category she herself fell into. Charlotte looked at her for a long moment, the way one looks at a puzzle piece that does not seem to belong to the picture, and said she genuinely did not know. Nora's family were respectable but not wealthy, well regarded but not connected, and nobody at the house seemed quite able to explain her invitation at all. Nora could have explained it herself, though she chose not to. Her family owed Ravenswick a debt of an old and complicated kind, a favor extended 2 generations back that had never quite been repaid, and the invitation had arrived at her father's door as a way of settling accounts without anyone having to say the word money out loud. She had not been invited because anyone believed she might charm a duke. She had been invited because her presence cost the family nothing and might, if fortune smiled, cost them a great deal less than they currently owed. She went to bed that night thinking about 30 women arranged like items in a shop window, and one duke walking past the glass without stopping, and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly she was doing there at all. The next morning, standing at the edge of another gathering she had not asked to attend, she watched a woman named Isabel recite 3 full lines of a poem the Duke was rumored to admire. Watched his face arrange itself into the same tired courtesy as the day before, and understood, with a kind of grim clarity, exactly what kind of week this was going to be. She had no poems memorized. She had no clever opinions rehearsed. She had a torn glove, a damp trunk, and a debt she had not asked to be part of. She decided, standing there in the cold morning light, that she would not be performing anything at all. The chance came on the 5th day, and it came by accident, the way most true things arrive. Nora had gone looking for the library, mostly to escape the drawing room where three women were competing over who could describe a sunset with the most original words. She took a wrong turning down an unfamiliar corridor and found herself in a smaller room lined with books that looked actually read, spines cracked, pages soft at the corners, rather than the untouched leather sets on display downstairs. She was running a finger along a shelf, tilting her head to read titles, when a voice behind her said that most people in this house did not know that room existed. She turned and found the Duke standing in the doorway with a glass of something amber in his hand, looking at her the way a man looks at an intruder he has decided, for the moment, not to report. She said she had gotten lost. It was mostly true. He said most people got lost toward the drawing room, not away from it, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a joke and not quite an accusation either. Nora, who had spent 5 days watching other women measure every word before speaking it, found she did not have the patience left to measure hers. She said the drawing room currently contained a competition to describe the color of the sky, and she had preferred her chances with a room full of books that could not talk back. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly put away. He crossed the room and pulled a slim volume from the shelf near her elbow, one she had been looking at moments before, and asked, in the tone of a man laying a trap he had laid many times already, whether she was familiar with the poet. She looked at the spine. She recognized the name from Isabel's recitation 2 mornings before, word for word, and understood at once that this was a test he had run on every woman in the house, and that every one of them had apparently passed it the same way, with warm enthusiasm and a borrowed opinion. She told him the truth. She said she had never read a single line of his work, and that based on the 4 lines she had heard recited in the garden earlier that week, she suspected she was not missing much, since the man seemed rather pleased with his own cleverness in a way that made the poetry harder to enjoy than it needed to be. The room went quiet in a way that made Nora briefly certain she had ruined something important, possibly her family's entire arrangement with this house. Then he laughed, properly laughed, the sound surprised out of him, and set the glass down on the shelf as though he needed both hands free for it. He said she was the first person in 9 days to tell him something true in that room, and that he had begun to suspect the entire house had been struck by the same peculiar illness, an illness that made every woman under 30 adore the exact same poet he happened to mention once, carelessly, to his aunt. Nora said that if it was a test, it was not a very fair one, since apparently everyone else had been warned about it in advance. He said that was rather the point. They spoke for perhaps 20 more minutes about nothing important, about books and the badly organized shelves, and a dog somewhere in the house that apparently hated the color yellow for reasons nobody could explain. It was, Nora realized walking back to her room afterward, the first conversation she had had all week that did not feel like a performance she was failing to give. She told herself this meant nothing. She was fairly sure it meant something, and did not enjoy how much that unsettled her. Word travels quickly in a house full of 30 women with nothing to do but watch each other, and by the following afternoon it was known, in the vague but confident way such things become known, that Nora Fenwick had spent time alone with the Duke in the small library, and had apparently insulted a poet he was fond of, and that he had laughed rather than been offended. The reaction split cleanly along lines Nora had already begun to notice. Charlotte found the whole thing amusing and told Nora she rather admired the nerve of it, whether it had been nerve or accident. Isabel, whose recitation had clearly been the source of the Duke's test, went pale and then very still, and did not speak to Nora again that week. A woman called Margaret, whom Nora had barely spoken 2 words to, began referring to her in a tone of careful, poisonous politeness that Nora recognized from her own village, where the same tone was used on women who had married above their station and would soon be reminded of it. Nora did her best to ignore all of it. She had not come to this house to make friends among the other guests, and she had certainly not come expecting the Duke to seek her out again. When he did, 3 days later, finding her in the same small library at nearly the same hour, she told herself it was coincidence and did not entirely believe herself. He asked this time, less like a test and more like a real question, what she thought of the house, of the season, of the whole strange arrangement 30 women had been gathered into. She considered lying. She had watched, all week, what happened to honesty in this house, how it curdled into gossip and cold politeness within a day. But something about the tired set of his shoulders, the way he asked the question like a man who had heard nothing but flattery for so long he had forgotten what a real answer sounded like, made her decide to risk it once more. She said the whole arrangement struck her as faintly ridiculous. 30 women dressed like prize cattle at a fair. Each one taught the same handful of tricks to distinguish herself from the others, when in fact the tricks made every single one of them sound identical. She said she suspected he could not actually remember which woman had said which clever thing by the end of most days, because none of it was really theirs to begin with. He was quiet for a moment, turning the glass in his hand, and then said that was, unfortunately, exactly correct, and that by the 3rd week of the previous season, he had genuinely confused 2 women's names because their rehearsed opinions on hunting had been word for word the same. Nora laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, sharp and a little too loud for the quiet room, and he looked pleased in a way that made something in her chest tighten unexpectedly. She asked him, since apparently they were being honest with each other, why he did not simply end the whole affair, since he plainly found none of it useful. His expression changed then, the humor draining out of it, replaced by something older and more tired than any 26-year-old face should carry. He said his father was dying upstairs, slowly and without much dignity left to him, and that the old man's dearest remaining wish was to see the title secured before he went, an heir promised if not yet born. He said he had agreed to this ridiculous parade of 30 women not because he believed love could be manufactured from a guest list, but because his father did not have many more wishes left to grant, and this one, unlike most, was actually within his power to give. Nora had not expected honesty of that size in return for her own, and it rearranged something in how she saw him. He was not simply a bored aristocrat amusing himself with the discomfort of hopeful women. He was a man doing an unpleasant duty for a dying father, doing it badly and resentfully, and finding almost nothing bearable about it except, apparently, the last 20 minutes he had spent complaining about it to a stranger in a library. She told him carefully that she was sorry and meant it, and did not try to soften it further with the kind of gentle nothing words the other women would have offered. He looked at her for a long moment and said that was, again, the first true thing anyone had said to him in this room in longer than he cared to admit. After that, their conversations in the library became less accidental. Nora told herself each time that it would be the last, that she had no business seeking the company of a man 30 other women were actively competing to marry, a man whose attention could do nothing but complicate a situation her family already needed uncomplicated. She told herself this and went back to the library anyway, on the 4th evening and the 6th, and did not examine too closely why. She learned in pieces the shape of him. He had a dry, understated humor that only surfaced once he had decided a person was not performing for him. He hated being agreed with reflexively and trusted almost nobody who did it. He asked once quietly whether she had siblings, and something in his tone made her suspect the question mattered to him more than its size suggested. She told him she had a brother once. She said it plainly in 4 words, and then changed the subject before he could ask anything further, and he, to his credit, did not push. He noticed, though. She could see it in the small pause before he answered her next question, the way his eyes stayed on her a moment longer than the conversation required. He filed the 4 words away without commenting on them, the way a careful man files away something he intends to return to later, when trust has grown large enough to hold the weight of it. Nora, for her part, noticed that he had begun seeking her out at hours when the other women were occupied elsewhere, that his Aunt Beatrice had started watching her across the dinner table with an expression Nora could not quite read, somewhere between suspicion and calculation. She noticed, too, that she had begun dressing with slightly more care for evenings that were supposedly ordinary, and hated herself a little for it. One evening, cornered by his questions after she had spent 20 minutes deflecting every attempt he made to compliment her, he finally asked, half laughing, half genuinely frustrated, whether she was capable of accepting a single kind word without turning it into a joke. She considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously, and then told him that he had a face that would look perfectly at home on a coin nobody wanted to spend, pretty enough to admire and entirely useless for anything practical. He stared at her for a full 3 seconds before the laugh broke out of him, loud enough that a maid passing the corridor outside glanced in with open curiosity. It was, Nora realized afterward, the closest she had come to giving the man a compliment all week, and she suspected he knew it too, and that he had decided, for reasons she did not yet understand, to be delighted by it rather than offended. She walked back to her small room that night thinking less about her family's debt, less about the 30 other women circling the same prize, and more about the particular quiet look on his face just before he had laughed, as though she had handed him something he had been missing for a very long time and had stopped expecting to find. The trouble began the way most trouble in that house began, quietly, over breakfast, in a tone so pleasant it took Nora a full minute to understand she was being attacked at all. Margaret was speaking to another guest, not to Nora directly, which was itself a kind of weapon, describing in a light and sympathetic voice how difficult it must be for certain families this season, families who had accepted an invitation to Ravenswick not out of any real hope of a match but simply because they could not afford to decline it, given what they owed the estate. She did not say Nora's name. She did not need to. Every head at that end of the table turned very slightly, the way heads turn when everyone already knows the answer to a question nobody has asked aloud. Nora kept her eyes on her plate and her hands steady around her cup and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not confirm exactly what Margaret wanted confirmed. Charlotte, beside her, gave Margaret a look sharp enough to cut glass, but the damage was already sitting on the table between them, and everyone at breakfast knew it. Nora finished her tea, excused herself with perfect composure, and did not allow her hands to shake until she was well clear of the dining room. Worse followed 2 days later. She had left her better dress, the mended one, draped over a chair in her room to air out the damp that had never quite left it since the ditch, and returned from a walk in the garden to find it ruined. Not torn by accident, torn with intention, a long clean rip down the bodice that no careless movement could produce, ink spilled across the skirt in a pattern too deliberate to be spillage. Nora stood in the doorway of her small room and looked at the one good dress she owned lying destroyed across the chair, and felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. She did not cry. She noted, with a kind of distant clarity, that she wanted to cry and that the wanting was somehow worse than the crying would have been, and she folded the ruined dress carefully anyway, the way her mother had taught her to fold things even when they were beyond saving, because some habits did not care whether the object deserved the care any longer. She did not know who had done it. She had suspicions, several of them, and she kept every one of those suspicions to herself, because nomming them without proof would only hand Margaret and her allies exactly the kind of scene they wanted, a common girl making wild accusations against her betters. That evening, she wore her second-best dress to dinner, the plain gray one she had brought only as a spare, and held her chin exactly where it had always been, and pretended not to notice the small, satisfied glances exchanged between 3 women near the far end of the table. The Duke noticed anyway. He found her afterward in the small library, later than usual, and asked directly what had happened, because apparently her composure at dinner had not been quite as complete as she believed it to be. She tried, at first, to deflect the question the way she deflected most things, with a dry remark about the fickle nature of fashion. He did not laugh. He simply waited in the particular quiet way he had, until the silence itself pulled the truth out of her. She told him about the dress. She kept her voice level while she told it, the way she had learned to keep her voice level about most things that mattered, and watched something harden in his face that she had not seen there before, not tiredness this time, something closer to anger held very carefully in check. He asked who she suspected. She said she had no proof of anything and did not intend to guess aloud. He said, quietly, that he had not asked for proof. He had asked who she suspected, and there was a difference between the two questions that he clearly expected her to understand. She still would not say the name, not because she was protecting anyone, but because she had learned, over 22 years of being the daughter of a family with more debts than land, that accusations from someone in her position rarely landed the way they were meant to, and often bounced back twice as hard. He let the matter rest that night, though the look on his face suggested he had not let it rest at all internally, only postponed the reckoning to a more useful hour. 3 days after that, at a dinner attended by nearly the full house, he did something that changed the shape of everything. He had never, in the 5 weeks of the season, shown any public preference among the 30 women gathered under his roof. He had been scrupulously, almost coldly even-handed at every meal, spreading his attention thin enough that no single woman could claim it and no single woman could be humiliated by its absence. That evening, he broke the pattern entirely. He seated Nora beside him. Not near him, not across from him, beside him, in the chair his Aunt Beatrice had clearly reserved for whichever guest she currently favored, and he did it without explanation, without apology, in front of every woman at that table and every servant besides. The room did not go silent exactly, but the conversation thinned noticeably, the way conversation thins when everyone present is straining to overhear something they are pretending not to listen for. Beatrice's face, at the head of the table, went carefully blank in the manner of a woman recalculating an entire strategy in the space of a single breath. Nora sat through that dinner with her spine perfectly straight and her hands perfectly steady, aware of every eye at the table, aware that she had just been handed a target painted directly onto her back, and aware, underneath the fear of it, of something that felt uncomfortably close to gratitude, and beneath that, something closer to dread, because she understood exactly what this gesture would cost her before the week was through. She was right to dread it. Beatrice found her the following morning, alone in the corridor outside the breakfast room, and spoke to her in a voice pitched low enough that no passing servant could hear it, though every word landed with the precision of something long prepared. She said she understood, better than anyone in this house, exactly why Nora had accepted the invitation. She said she had made inquiries, discreet ones, and knew precisely how much the Fenwick family owed Ravenswick, knew the figure to the shilling, and wished Nora to understand that whatever fantasy she had begun entertaining in that library would not settle a single debt her father owed. Nora felt something rise in her then that was not sorrow, not shame, but a hot, clean anger she recognized the way one recognizes an old coat pulled from the back of a closet, worn many times before and still fitting exactly the same. It was, she realized distantly, the same anger she had reached for years ago, after her brother, the same familiar heat that steadied her hands even as it burned. She had learned, a long time ago, that anger did useful work where grief only made her useless, and she reached for it now the way a person reaches for a rail on a staircase in the dark. She told Beatrice, in a voice that did not shake at all, that she had come to this house because her family owed a debt. Yes, that was true, and she was not ashamed of it, and that she had never once, not in 5 weeks, asked the Duke for anything beyond honest conversation, which was evidently more than most of the women under this roof had managed to offer him. She said that if Beatrice wished to accuse her of scheming for a title, she would need better evidence than a seating arrangement the Duke himself had chosen without consulting either of them. Beatrice's expression flickered briefly with something that might have been respect, quickly buried beneath composure again, and she left without another word, which Nora understood to be, in its own way, a kind of retreat. The peace did not last. That same afternoon, at a gathering in the garden meant to celebrate nothing in particular beyond an excuse for 30 women to display themselves in good light, Margaret cornered Nora near the roses with 2 allies flanking her, and said, pleasantly enough that a passing observer might have mistaken it for friendly conversation, that everyone in the house now understood precisely why Nora had been invited, and precisely what she was truly after, and that it was, in Margaret's opinion, a rather desperate performance for a woman with nothing else to offer. Nora felt the anger rise again, hot and familiar, and this time she did not entirely control it. She said, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look, that she had never once performed anything in this house. Unlike certain women who had spent 5 weeks memorizing poetry, they had never actually read and reciting hunting stories that grew a little taller each time they were told. She said her family's debt was no secret and no shame, unlike whatever debts certain other families in this garden were currently working very hard to hide behind a great deal of silk. She said finally, and this was the part she regretted almost as soon as it left her mouth, that she had come to this house because her family had no other choice, that the invitation had been extended not out of hope but out of obligation, that she had known from the very first day she stepped through that gate that she was never truly meant to be chosen, only tolerated, and that she was, frankly, exhausted by 5 weeks of being asked to smile through it. The garden had gone properly silent by the time she finished. 30 faces turned toward her, and somewhere at the edge of that silence, unnoticed by Nora until it was too late to take the words back, stood the Duke himself. He had not been meant to hear any of it. He had come out to the garden by accident, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and arrived in time to hear the last and worst of it, the part where Nora said plainly in front of everyone that she had never come there for him at all, only for the debt, only for the obligation, only because her family had no other choice. Their eyes met across the garden for one long, terrible moment. Nora watched something close behind his face, a door swinging shut she could not see the far side of, and understood, with a sinking, sickening clarity, that whatever had been growing quietly between them in that small library had just been handed a wound it might not survive. He said nothing. He turned, after a moment, and walked back into the house, and Nora stood among 30 women who had just watched her humiliate herself twice in one afternoon, and felt the anger drain out of her all at once, leaving behind only the cold understanding of exactly what she had said, and exactly who had heard it. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the small room at the end of the corridor, listening to the house settle around her, and turned the moment over and over, the way one turns a stone looking for the smooth side. She had told the truth. Every word of it had been true, and the truth, spoken in anger, in front of 30 witnesses and one Duke who had just spent 5 weeks choosing honesty over performance, had somehow done more damage than any lie could have managed. She thought, too, in the darkest hour of that sleepless night, about her brother, about the particular shape of grief that had taught her to reach for anger instead, because anger asked less of her than sorrow did, and sorrow was a room she had not fully entered in years and did not know if she could leave again once she did. She did not examine that thought for long. She never did. She simply noted it, the way she noted most things about herself, and set it aside, and waited for morning, uncertain whether there would be any place left for her in this house once it came. Morning brought no summons, no note, no sign that the Duke intended to speak with her at all, and Nora understood that silence in a house like this was its own kind of answer. She kept to her room as long as she reasonably could, and when hunger finally forced her down to breakfast, she found the table arranged exactly as it always had been before that single dinner. No chair beside the head of the table reserved for her. No eyes lingering on her with anything but the same cool curiosity she had grown used to in her first weeks there. Beatrice presided over the meal with an air of quiet satisfaction that told Nora everything she needed to know about how the previous day's scene had been received below stairs. Margaret did not gloat, which was somehow worse than gloating would have been. She simply looked at Nora with something close to pity, and pity from Margaret was a wound all its own. The Duke did not appear at breakfast, nor at the midday meal, nor in the garden, nor in the small library where Nora found herself standing that evening out of habit more than hope, staring at shelves she had stopped seeing weeks ago, waiting for a footstep that did not come. 3 days passed this way. Nora told herself on each of them that she did not care, that she had said nothing untrue, that a man who could not forgive an honest woman for losing her temper under deliberate provocation was perhaps not a man worth the ache she felt every time she caught sight of his study window from the garden path. She told herself this with great conviction, and believed almost none of it. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from her father. It was shorter than his letters usually were, which alarmed her before she had even broken the seal, because her father was a man who filled pages the way other men filled silence, out of a nervous habit of never quite trusting a short sentence to do its work. This letter ran barely half a page. It said that a gentleman named Edmund Colby, a widower of good standing and modest but reliable fortune from the neighboring county, had called on the family twice in the past fortnight, had expressed a clear and sincere interest in Nora, and had, in terms her father described as generous beyond anything the family had reason to expect, offered to settle the entire debt owed to Ravenswick as part of any marriage arrangement, regardless of what came of the current season at the Hall. Her father did not instruct her to accept. He was not that kind of man. But the letter's brevity said what its sentences did not, that the offer had arrived at a moment when the family's other prospects had grown thin enough to see through, and that a father who loved his daughter and also loved his remaining children enough to want them fed was finding it harder each week to see a reason to refuse a solution this clean. Nora read the letter twice, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the small room at the end of the corridor, and felt something in her chest settle into a kind of exhausted calm she recognized from other difficult decisions in her life. The calm that came not from certainty, but from simply running out of energy to keep fighting a conclusion that had been approaching for some time regardless of her feelings about it. She wrote back that same evening, before she could talk herself out of it, and told her father that she would return home within the week, and that if Mr. Colby's interest remained sincere upon her return, she saw no reason to discourage it further. She did not examine, too closely, why writing those words felt like closing a door she had only just begun to walk through. Word of her intended departure reached the house faster than she expected, the way all news traveled in that place, and Beatrice was the first to acknowledge it directly, catching Nora in the corridor with an expression that had softened, unexpectedly, into something almost like sympathy, though sympathy from Beatrice arrived wrapped in the same careful calculation as everything else she said. She told Nora that she thought this was, all things considered, a sensible decision, and that she wished her well in it, and there was nothing unkind in the words at all, which somehow made them land harder than any cruelty could have. Charlotte, when she heard, was considerably less composed about it. She found Nora packing the following afternoon and demanded, with real feeling, whether Nora intended to simply vanish without a word to the man she had spent 5 weeks quietly falling for, whether one bad afternoon in a garden was truly enough to undo whatever had been growing in that library, whether Nora was leaving because she wanted to or because it had simply become the path of least resistance, and she was too tired to choose anything harder. Nora did not have a good answer to any of these questions, and told Charlotte so honestly, which seemed to satisfy her friend rather more than a confident answer would have. She was meant to leave on the 7th day in the early morning, before most of the house had woken. She had arranged for the carriage the night before, had said her quiet goodbyes to the 2 or 3 women in the house she had genuinely come to like, and had gone to bed with the particular hollow feeling of a decision made and no longer available for reconsideration. She did not know, lying awake that final night, that the Duke had spent those same 4 silent days locked in a battle considerably harder than her own. His father had taken a turn for the worse on the very evening of the garden scene, a turn severe enough that the household physician had been summoned twice in one night, and the Duke had spent 3 of those 4 silent days at his father's bedside rather than avoiding Nora out of anger, watching an old man's breath grow shallower by careful degrees, listening to him ask, in the rare hours he was lucid enough to ask anything at all, whether his son had found anyone yet, whether there was any hope of an heir before the end came for him. Callum had not known, in those 3 days, what to tell his father, because he did not know himself what had happened in that garden, only that he had heard words spoken in anger that sounded, on their surface, exactly like the confirmation of everything his aunt had been warning him about for weeks, that Nora Fenwick had come for the debt and nothing more, that whatever he had felt growing in that small library had been, on her side at least, nothing more than a woman doing what circumstance required of her. He believed this mostly for 3 days, and hated how much it hurt to believe it. On the 4th day, sitting again at his father's bedside in the gray hour before dawn, his father, weaker than Callum had ever seen him, but lucid in that particular way the dying sometimes become, just before the end, asked him directly whether there was a woman in that house he actually wanted, apart from anything the title required, apart from anything Beatrice had arranged or any family owed any debt. Callum found, to his own surprise, that the answer arrived without hesitation, whole and certain, before he had even finished deciding to say it aloud. He told his father about the library, about the poet neither of them had actually read, about 4 words spoken about a brother and never explained, about a woman who had told him the truth every single time he had asked for it, even when the truth cost her, even when it would have been easier and safer to simply agree with him, the way every other woman in that house had learned to do. His father, weak as he was, managed something close to a smile, and told his son that a man did not find honesty like that twice in a lifetime, and that if his son let a single bad afternoon undo 5 weeks of it, he would deserve exactly the loneliness that followed. Callum left his father's room that morning with the words still settling in him, and went looking for Nora immediately, only to learn from a startled housemaid that Miss Fenwick's carriage had already left the gate not 20 minutes before. He did not stop to think. He called for his own horse, faster than any carriage, and rode after her down the same north road where her wheel had cracked 5 weeks earlier, urging the animal harder than was sensible on a road still rutted from the spring rains, because some decisions, once made clearly enough, did not leave room for caution. He caught the carriage just past the crossroads, riding alongside it and calling for the driver to stop, and Nora, hearing her name shouted outside the window in a voice she had spent 4 silent days trying not to think about, felt her whole chest tighten before she had even looked outside. She stepped down into the road, and there he was, breathless from riding, his coat unbuttoned, looking nothing at all like the composed and tired Duke she had first seen across a rose garden 5 weeks before. He said her name once, and then seemed to lose every carefully prepared word he must have practiced on the ride, because what came out instead was simply that he had heard about Edmund Colby, that his aunt had told him everything the moment the news reached the house, and that he did not know, standing there in the cold morning air, whether he had any right at all to ask her to reconsider, given everything he had let a single bad afternoon convince him of. Nora stood in the mud of that same north road, the mirror image of where this entire story had begun, and found that she, too, had lost every word she had spent 4 days preparing, and said nothing at all, only looked at him, waiting to see what he would do with the silence now that he had finally caught up to it. He spoke first, because someone had to, and because he had ridden 4 miles at a reckless pace specifically to say something, and standing there wordless after all that effort seemed a poor use of a good horse. He said that he had spent 5 weeks watching 30 women tell him exactly what they believed he wanted to hear, and that somewhere in the middle of all of it, without quite meaning to, he had stopped listening to any of them at all, because none of what they said belonged to them. It belonged to whatever version of him they had decided to build. He said that when she had told him the truth in that garden, the ugly, unflattering truth about debt and obligation and a family with no other choice, some part of him had heard only the ugliness of it and missed, entirely, what it actually meant, that she was the only woman in that house who had never once lied to him, not even when the truth made her look small, not even when the truth cost her everything she might have gained by simply staying quiet. He said his father, dying upstairs in a room that no longer had many more mornings left in it, had asked him a single honest question 4 days ago, whether there was a woman in that house he actually wanted apart from any duty attached to her, and that the answer had come to him whole and immediate, before he had even finished deciding to speak it, and the answer was standing in front of him, now in the mud of a road that had broken her carriage wheel exactly 5 weeks before. Nora listened to all of this with her hands pressed together in front of her, feeling the particular tightness in her throat that she recognized, distantly, as the beginning of tears she had not allowed herself in longer than she could easily remember, and found, when she finally spoke, that she did not want to spend her words defending herself, because he had not asked her to. She told him instead about her brother. She had never said more than 4 words about him to anyone in that house, and she said considerably more than 4 now, standing in the cold morning air with the horse breathing steam beside them, and the carriage driver pretending very hard not to listen. She told him her brother had died 3 years before, suddenly, in a manner nobody in her family had ever fully recovered from discussing plainly, and that in the months after, she had discovered that anger did useful work where grief only left her useless, that reaching for anger instead of sorrow had become, without her ever quite deciding it, the way she survived most difficult things since. She said the anger in that garden had not been about Margaret at all, not really. It had simply been the nearest handhold available when she felt herself falling, and she was sorry, genuinely sorry, that it had landed on him. He did not offer sympathy dressed up in soft, useless words, the way she had half expected and quietly dreaded. He simply said that he understood reaching for the nearest steady thing when the ground gave way, better than she perhaps realized, having spent 3 days at his father's bedside doing something remarkably similar with duty instead of anger, and that he did not think less of her for it, only wished she had trusted him enough, weeks ago, to tell him the whole 4 words rather than only the first 2. Nora, for the first time in longer than she could remember, found she had nothing clever to deflect with, and said simply that she would try, if given the chance, to trust him with more than 4 words at a time going forward. He asked then, plainly, without any of the poetry the other women had rehearsed for him, whether she would come back to Ravenswick, not for the debt, not for her family's arrangement with the estate, but because he was asking her to, for himself, as honestly as he knew how to ask anything. She looked past him, back down the road toward the hall she had just spent an hour riding away from, and thought of Edmund Colby's generous, sensible offer waiting at home, an offer that would settle her family's troubles cleanly and ask nothing complicated of her in return. And she thought too of 30 women still under that roof who would not welcome her back kindly, and of Beatrice's careful calculations, and of a dying man upstairs whose approval she had never earned and might never have the chance to. None of it weighed against the particular steadiness in Callum's face as he waited for her answer, seemed to matter as much as she expected it to. She said yes. The ride back to Ravenswick was slower than the ride away from it, the carriage following at its own careful pace, while Nora walked the last stretch beside Callum's horse, neither of them saying much of anything, both of them apparently content to let the silence be a comfortable one for the first time in days. When they reached the gate, the same iron gate she had first seen with mud to her knees 5 weeks before, she found she was smiling in a way she had not allowed herself in this house until that exact moment. The weeks that followed were not simple, and nobody pretended otherwise. The old Duke lived another 6 weeks, long enough to meet Nora properly, sitting up in his bed for a single clear-headed hour to ask her, with the same bluntness his son had apparently inherited from him, whether she intended to actually love his son or merely tolerate him for the title. And Nora, without hesitating, told him she had spent 5 weeks trying very hard not to love his son at all and had failed rather badly at it, which seemed to satisfy the old man more than any softer answer could have. He died peacefully enough in his sleep 3 weeks after that conversation, and Callum grieved him in the quiet, undramatic way of a man who had already said most of what needed saying while there was still time to say it. Beatrice never fully warmed to Nora, not in any way that could be called friendship, but she did, eventually, stop referring to the Fenwick debt in every conversation where Nora's name came up, which Nora understood from a woman like Beatrice to be as close to acceptance as she was ever likely to receive, and decided she could live comfortably enough with that. Margaret left Ravenswick within the fortnight, along with most of the other 29 women who had come for a season that had clearly concluded without them, and Nora heard, much later, second-hand and without much interest, that Margaret had gone on to marry a baron in a neighboring county, and seemed, by all accounts, reasonably content with the arrangement, which Nora found she genuinely did not mind at all. Charlotte stayed in correspondence with Nora long after the season ended, writing letters full of the same sharp humor that had made her the one friend Nora had actually made in that strange competitive house, and visited Ravenswick twice in the following year, each time declaring loudly, and without any real seriousness, that she still expected credit for having told Nora, quite early on, that one bad afternoon in a garden was not enough to undo 5 weeks of something real. Nora's father settled his debt to the estate not through Edmund Colby's generous offer, which was quietly and kindly declined, but through her marriage to Callum itself, which resolved the matter far more thoroughly than any sum of money could have, though Nora made certain, in the years that followed, that her family's finances were managed with rather more care than they had been managed before, so that no future daughter of that house would ever need to walk 4 miles down a muddy road toward a stranger's gate out of obligation rather than choice. On the morning of their wedding, a small affair by the standards of the house, since neither of them had much appetite left for grand performances after everything the season had put them through, Callum gave her a single gift instead of the jewelry or fine things his aunt had suggested, a slim, worn volume of the very poet he had once tested her with in the library, the pages now cracked and soft at the corners in a way that suggested actual reading rather than display. Tucked inside the front cover in his own hand was a single line, not from the poet at all, simply 4 words of his own, still not very good. Nora laughed the same real, too loud laugh she had given him that first evening in the library, and kept the book on the shelf nearest her side of the bed for the rest of her life, not because the poetry inside it had ever improved with rereading, but because it was, in its own small and slightly ridiculous way, the truest thing anyone in that entire strange season had ever given her.